researchers were doing a lot of very fundamental glacier and climate research. Camp Century is probably best known for being home of the first deep ice core to the bed of the Greenland ice sheet. It's like nothing we have today.
Beneath the vast, frozen expanse of Greenland's ice sheet lies a chilling secret from the Cold War, a relic of espionage, engineering marvel, and environmental controversy. When NASA's Jet Propulsion laboratory detected strange radar echoes emanating from deep within the ice, no one could have predicted the hidden world they were about to unearth. The US Army's top-secret military city under the ice, built during the height of Cold War tensions and buried over 100 feet below the surface. This astonishing revelation, known today as Camp Century, not only reshaped our understanding of the Arctic's role in global conflict, but also ignited questions about the long-term consequences of humanity's secret ambitions hidden in ice. This is one story you just can't miss. Let's start from the very beginning. Origins and strategic significance. During the Cold War, the United States sought to fortify its strategic posture against the Soviet Union by leveraging the unique geography of Greenland. This Arctic territory, situated nearly equidistant between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, attracted the interest of the US military back in the Second World War, when the 1941 agreement between the United States and Denmark permitted American forces to establish bases on the island to defend against German incursions. This arrangement was reaffirmed and expanded upon in the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement, which allowed the US to construct and operate defense areas in Greenland in cooperation with Denmark, under the auspices of NATO. Amid escalating tensions in the 1950s, US Army engineers initiated plans to construct a new base beneath Greenland's ice sheet. In May 1959, a team surveyed and selected a location approximately 150 miles inland from Thule Air Base, leading to the establishment of Camp Century. Officially presented as a scientific research station, Camp Century was, in reality, a prototype for a more ambitious project known as Project Iceworm. The goal? To install a network of nuclear missile launch sites beneath the ice. Project Iceworm, and the real objective. Conceived in the late 1950s, Project Iceworm's primary objective was to position up to 600 nuclear missiles within striking distance of the Soviet Union, all concealed under the Arctic ice. To test the feasibility of such an ambitious endeavor, the US Army constructed Camp Century in 1959, located approximately 150 miles inland from Thule Air Base in northwestern Greenland. Publicly presented as a scientific research station, Camp Century served as the operational front for Project Iceworm. The camp featured a series of tunnels extending over 3,000 meters, housing laboratories, living quarters, and support facilities. A notable feature was the PM-2A portable nuclear reactor, which provided power to the base, marking one of the earliest instances of a nuclear-powered facility in the Arctic. The envisioned missile complex under Project Iceworm was to span an area of approximately 135,000 square kilometers, with 2 to 100 launch points interconnected by 4,000 kilometers of tunnels. The missiles, designated as Iceman, were a modified version of the Air Force's Minuteman missiles, adapted for deployment under the ice. The design aimed to allow for the rotation of missiles among various launch sites to enhance survivability and complicate enemy targeting. Despite initial optimism, the project encountered significant challenges. The Greenland ice sheet's dynamic nature, characterized by its viscoelastic properties, led to structural instability within the tunnels. By 1962, the ceiling of the reactor room had dropped and required lifting by 5 feet. These issues, coupled with the realization that the ice was not as stable as initially believed, forced the USA to operate Camp Century as a summer-only facility. The nuclear reactor was removed in 1965, and the camp was abandoned in 1967. Politically, Project Iceworm was fraught with complications. While the United States had legal access to Greenland through defense agreements with Denmark, the full extent of the project's objectives was not disclosed to the Danish government. This lack of transparency led to tensions between the two nations, especially after the project's details were declassified in the 1990s. In recent years, climate change has raised concerns about the potential release of hazardous materials from the melting ice covering Camp Century. Studies suggest that by the end of the 21st century, melting could expose the site's waste, posing environmental risks. Public presentation and infrastructure. In the early 1960s, the US Army unveiled Camp Century. This public portrayal emphasized the camp's role in advancing polar science and engineering, highlighting its innovative infrastructure designed to ensure livability and self-sufficiency in the harsh Arctic environment. However, beneath this facade lay a covert objective: Project Iceworm. The facility was constructed using a cut-and-cover trenching technique and comprised 21 tunnels stretching over 3,000 by 1,000 meters. These tunnels housed prefabricated buildings, including dormitories, a kitchen and cafeteria, a hospital, a laundry, a communications center, a recreation hall, a chapel, and even a barbershop. To bolster the camp's public image, the US Army produced a documentary titled Camp Century: City Under Ice in 1964. This film showcased the modern amenities and scientific endeavors at the facility. Despite the emphasis on scientific research, Camp Century's true purpose was to establish a network of nuclear missile launch sites beneath Greenland's ice, leveraging the camp's infrastructure as a testbed for feasibility. The plan envisioned deploying up to 600 missiles across an area of 135,000 square kilometers, with 2,100 launch points interconnected by 4,000 kilometers of tunnels. The sheer scale of Project Iceworm was nothing short of audacious, and the potential destructive power of the envisioned missile system was enormous. If the full-scale deployment had succeeded, up to 600 nuclear-tipped intermediate-range ballistic missiles would have been stationed beneath Greenland's ice sheet. The specific missile type under consideration for Project Iceworm was the SM-68 Titan I, and later, discussions included Minuteman I missiles, each armed with a thermonuclear warhead. The Titan I carried a W-38 warhead with a yield of around 3.75 megatons, whereas the Minuteman I was equipped with a W-59 warhead estimated at around 1 megaton. For context, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. A 1 megaton warhead is roughly 66 times more powerful, while a 3.75 megaton warhead is 250 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. If all 600 missiles were fired, they could obliterate dozens of major cities and kill hundreds of millions of people. As for launch time, the design of Project Iceworm intended for missiles to be stored in underground silos connected by a 4,000-kilometer tunnel network. The idea was to ensure the missiles could survive a Soviet first strike and be fired quickly in retaliation. This is what is called second strike capability. For the Minuteman I, a solid-fueled missile, launch times were relatively fast, on the order of minutes once the command was given. This rapid response capability was a key reason for considering solid-fuel missiles in the project. Had it been operational, the entire system would have functioned as a hidden, distributed nuclear arsenal in the Arctic, one that could launch hundreds of nuclear warheads toward the Soviet Union within minutes of a go order, potentially overwhelming Soviet defenses and decimating strategic targets across Eurasia. However, Project Iceworm was never completed. Still, the potential impact, had it succeeded, would have been catastrophic on a planetary scale. Luckily, the dynamic nature of the ice sheet led to structural instability within the tunnels, and the harsh Arctic environment imposed severe logistical constraints. By 1967, these issues, coupled with the realization that the ice was not as stable as initially believed, led to the abandonment of Camp Century. But is this indeed the full story? Well, some observers like to disagree. theories behind the base. Constructed by the US Army Corps of Engineers between 1959 and 1960, Camp Century was publicly presented as a scientific research station in northwest Greenland, but we already know that this was not the case. Naturally, this lack of transparency has forced people to question the government's narrative. Some suggest that Camp Century may have been involved in weather modification experiments, an idea rooted in the broader context of US military interest in climate manipulation during the Cold War. Historical projects like Project Cirrus and Operation Popeye demonstrate that weather modification was not an entirely fringe concept within military planning circles. The unique atmospheric and environmental conditions of the Arctic, where Camp Century was situated, could have provided a valuable testing ground for experiments aimed at understanding and potentially influencing weather patterns. Proponents of this theory argue that the extreme environment offered an opportunity to study atmospheric dynamics in ways that could inform weather warfare or climate engineering strategies. However, the evidence supporting this hypothesis remains largely circumstantial. No declassified documents or credible first-hand accounts directly tie Camp Century to weather modification programs, and the theory remains speculative, resting on broader patterns of military interest in environmental control rather than specific links to the base itself. A further hypothesis posits that Camp Century was a prototype for space colonization efforts, a bold idea that draws on the striking parallels between the base's design and the requirements for extraterrestrial habitation. Camp Century was a self-contained, isolated habitat powered by a nuclear reactor, equipped with life support systems, waste management protocols, and facilities for sustaining human life in an extreme environment. The psychological and physiological challenges faced by personnel stationed there, ranging from isolation to limited resources, mirror the conditions expected in potential off-world colonies. Proponents of this theory suggest that the US military and scientific community may have used Camp Century as a testbed for technologies and protocols relevant to future space exploration. However, like the weather modification theory, this perspective lacks direct evidence. There are no declassified documents, mission statements, or official communications that explicitly link Camp Century to space colonization objectives. The abandonment of Camp Century has also given rise to pressing environmental concerns, particularly in light of climate change and the accelerating melt of the Greenland ice sheet. The base, effectively frozen in time for decades, contains an unsettling legacy of hazardous materials, including an estimated 200,000 litres of diesel fuel, 24 million litres of untreated sewage, and unknown quantities of radioactive waste from the PM2A reactor. As global temperatures rise, the once stable ice that entombed Camp Century is melting at an alarming rate. Climate models suggest that by the end of the 21st century, the contaminants left behind by the base could resurface, seeping into surrounding ecosystems and potentially reaching the ocean, where they could disrupt delicate Arctic food chains and impact marine life. The looming threat of these toxic remnants has sparked diplomatic tensions between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland. The US has yet to take meaningful action to address the potential environmental hazards, a neglect that raises troubling questions about accountability for the long-term consequences of Cold War-era military activities. This issue transcends mere environmental stewardship. It touches on broader themes of justice, sovereignty, and the moral obligations of powerful nations toward the lands and people affected by their geopolitical ambitions. While Camp Century's central role in Project Iceworm is well documented and indisputable, the theories surrounding its broader purposes, whether in weather manipulation, space colonization, or scientific exploration, reflect the deep uncertainties and suspicions that inevitably arise when governments operate in secrecy. The base's existence highlights the Cold War-era mindset that sought to weaponize every possible advantage, even at the expense of transparency, environmental ethics, and the sovereignty of allied nations. After decades, The facility is back to haunt the world, but one has to ask, why was it abandoned? Camp Abandonment and official explanation. Camp Century was constructed roughly 100 feet beneath the Greenland ice cap, using a novel cut-and-cover trenching method. Engineers excavated long trenches into the ice, lined them with prefabricated modular structures, and then covered the complex with snow and ice, effectively creating a subterranean city. Despite its groundbreaking engineering and strategic promise, Camp Century faced formidable challenges. The ice sheet itself proved to be less stable than anticipated. The constant movement and deformation of the ice began to compromise the integrity of the tunnels and infrastructure. Cracks, ice creep, and shifts gradually undermined the camp's safety and operational viability. By the mid-1960s, these environmental factors presented increasing risks. In 1966, after less than a decade of operation, Camp Century was officially abandoned. What followed, however, was a profound silence from official sources. The United States government and military agencies offered no public rationale for closing a base with such clear strategic importance, nor did they clarify the future of the sensitive materials left behind, including the nuclear reactor and assorted waste. The reactor was removed before abandonment, but the bulk of Camp Century's infrastructure and stored waste, some radioactive and chemical, were buried under the ice and essentially forgotten, presumed to be permanently entombed by the Greenland ice sheet. The lack of transparency around Camp Century's closure stands in stark contrast to the initial extensive publicity the project received. The base was heavily featured in documentaries and media coverage, such as the 1964 film City Under Ice, which extolled the camp's self-sufficiency and technological marvels. This abrupt shift to silence fueled speculation and conspiracy theories. Was the abandonment driven purely by environmental realities, or were there undisclosed strategic recalculations behind the scenes? Was the ice instability a convenient explanation masking the cancellation of Project Iceworm itself? Official archives later revealed that growing concerns about the ice's movement and the high costs of maintaining such a complex installation in an unforgiving environment heavily influenced the decision. The primary issue lay in the very foundation of the project, the dynamic, ever-shifting nature of Greenland's ice sheet. When Project Iceworm was conceived in the late 1950s, military planners viewed Greenland's ice sheet as a stable, static platform, a frozen continent ideal for concealing a vast network of nuclear missiles. However, this assumption was quickly undermined by the harsh realities of glaciology. Greenland's ice sheet, which today spans roughly 1.7 million square kilometers and contains about 2.85 million cubic kilometers of ice, enough to raise global sea levels by about 7.4 meters if fully melted, is not a rigid, immobile mass. It is a dynamic, flowing body of ice, moving at rates that vary from a few meters to several kilometers per year, depending on location, temperature, and underlying bedrock conditions. Data gathered during the Camp Century project revealed that the ice at the site was moving at an average rate of about 1 meter per year, a fact that soon became a nightmare for military engineers. While the rate may seem slow, over a span of just 5 years, that movement was enough to warp the tunnels, misalign structural supports, and threaten the integrity of the base's carefully designed infrastructure. The tunnels themselves, constructed from reinforced snow and steel supports, began to deform, with ceilings sagging, walls buckling, and ice slowly encroaching upon living and operational spaces. Maintenance teams were constantly battling to keep the tunnels open, but the costs and manpower required were rapidly spiraling out of control. The high costs of maintaining Camp Century became a significant burden. While exact figures are fragmented across reports, internal estimates suggest that annual maintenance costs for Camp Century exceeded $5.7 million by the mid-1960s, far above initial projections. The logistics of resupplying the base, including the nuclear reactor's fuel and basic provisions for the crew, were equally daunting. Camp Century was located 215 kilometers inland from Thule Air Base, and all supplies had to be transported over treacherous ice roads via tracked vehicles or airdropped when conditions allowed. The reactor itself, the PM-2A, presented another set of challenges, as it required specialized support, monitoring and maintenance that taxed available resources. But the instability of the ice sheet posed a much graver risk beyond logistical headaches. Greenland's ice, driven by gravity and internal deformation, is constantly in motion, a fact that renders any attempt to construct long-term, rigid structures beneath it inherently unsustainable. As Camp Century's tunnels began to buckle and collapse, it became clear that any missile system deployed beneath the ice would face catastrophic failure. Structural analyses conducted by Army engineers projected that, within a decade, the entire base could be rendered inoperable by ice deformation, a timeline that effectively doomed Project Iceworm. Moreover, the risk extended beyond operational failure. If nuclear missiles had ever been installed, their security could have been compromised by tunnel collapses or breaches, potentially leading to radiation leaks, or even the inadvertent detonation of nuclear warheads under the ice, a nightmare scenario that would have unleashed radioactive contamination across the Arctic and possibly beyond. These concerns were compounded by the lack of Danish consent for nuclear weapons deployment in Greenland. In 1957, Denmark officially declared itself a nuclear-free zone, a policy reaffirmed multiple times throughout the Cold War. The US had not informed the Danish government of Project Iceworm's true objectives, and the revelation of its existence years later, through declassified documents and investigative journalism, sparked political outrage and diplomatic tensions that persist to this day. The ethical implications of constructing a nuclear missile base on foreign soil without consent, coupled with the environmental risks posed by the unstable ice sheet, reflected the unsustainability of the project on both moral and practical grounds. From an environmental perspective, the instability of Greenland's ice sheet carries global consequences that were poorly understood at the time. Today, we know that the Greenland ice sheet loses an average of 270 billion metric tons of ice per year, contributing significantly to global sea level rise. The meltwater from Greenland has been linked to disruptions in the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, a critical component of global ocean currents that helps regulate climate patterns in the North Atlantic and beyond. Had Project Iceworm proceeded, the long-term risks of nuclear contamination from collapsing tunnels and leaking radioactive waste could have exacerbated these vulnerabilities. Seeing all of this, the United States quietly shut down Project Iceworm by 1967. Camp Century itself was effectively abandoned, its reactor removed in 1964, and the site left to be entombed by the very ice that had thwarted its ambitions. Yet, as the Greenland ice sheet continues to melt in the face of climate change, the toxic remnants of Camp Century may soon re-emerge. But there was another reason for abandoning the facility. Moreover, the emergence of intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM technology, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, reduced the strategic necessity for fixed missile bases under the ice, as mobile platforms provided more flexible and survivable nuclear deterrents. This evolution in military technology made the expensive and vulnerable Iceworm concept less relevant. Unfortunately, the US military left behind significant quantities of hazardous waste beneath the ice. Over 200,000 gallons of diesel fuel, solvents, polychlorinated biphenyls, sewage, and radioactive materials from the PM-2A reactor remain trapped under the ice. The decision not to recover or properly dispose of these materials reflected the era's limited environmental oversight and the assumption that the ice would indefinitely isolate and contain the waste. Today, climate change and accelerating glacial melt raise renewed concerns about the potential exposure and release of these contaminants, posing environmental risks for Greenland and the North Atlantic ecosystem. But maybe there's more to it than this. As noted earlier, the official narrative for Camp Century's Abandonment centers on the discovery that the Greenland ice sheet was far less stable than initially believed. Critics question this reasoning, pointing out that the movement and deformation of glaciers are well-known phenomena and should have been apparent during the lengthy construction and operational phases. The ice sheet's dynamics were well studied even then, given Greenland's significance to climate science and Cold War strategic positioning. This raises the question, if the ice shifting was such a critical threat, why was it not identified earlier? Was the failure to foresee the ice movement a simple engineering miscalculation, or did it serve as a convenient cover for a deeper, undisclosed problem? Some theorists argue that structural damage alone would not necessitate complete abandonment, especially given the significant investment and strategic importance of Project Iceworm. Instead, they suggest that the military may have encountered unforeseen technical, environmental, or political challenges. Camp Century's Abandonment also touches on broader geopolitical and strategic dimensions. The US has demonstrated heightened interest in Greenland in recent years, exemplified by military agreements and infrastructure investments that some analysts interpret as efforts to maintain strategic influence in the Arctic. This renewed focus is officially justified by the growing importance of the Arctic for climate monitoring, new shipping routes due to ice melt, and resource exploration. However, skeptics argue that the US interest may also be motivated by a desire to control and possibly conceal the historical legacy of Cold War projects like Camp Century, preventing unwanted exposure of military secrets or environmental liabilities. Greenland's political status as an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark adds complexity to these dynamics. The original US military presence on the island, including Thule Air Base and Camp Century, was permitted through defense agreements with Denmark dating back to the Second World War and reaffirmed in the early 1950s. In light of the environmental and geopolitical stakes, the US government's efforts to maintain a strong presence may be driven not only by modern strategic calculations related to Arctic security, but also by a desire to manage the historical and environmental consequences of projects left under the ice decades ago. Adding to the skepticism surrounding the official story is the nature of information management during the Cold War. Much of Camp Century's history, particularly the military ambitions under Project Iceworm, remained classified for decades. Only in recent years have declassified documents and research shed light on the secret missile plans and the extent of the nuclear waste abandoned at the site. This historical pattern of secrecy suggests that there may have been additional, still undisclosed reasons for the base's closure, ranging from technical failures to political decisions influenced by shifting military priorities. In any case, as the Arctic continues to warm and the ice recedes, the secrets of Camp Century are increasingly likely to resurface, demanding transparency, accountability, and renewed cooperation among all stakeholders in the region. Re-examining conspiracy theories. As researchers and commentators revisit the historical data and emerging scientific findings, multiple theories have resurfaced, challenging the official narrative and urging a deeper re-examination of what Camp Century really represented. One of the foremost alternative interpretations re-examined today is the idea that Camp Century functioned primarily as a survival bunker in case of a nuclear exchange, and not just as a launch site. During the late 1950s and early 60s, the US and the USSR were locked in an escalating arms race, with both sides expanding their nuclear arsenals and developing complex doctrines like mutually assured destruction. Hardened facilities designed to withstand nuclear attack, such as the Cheyenne Mountain Complex or Site R, were a critical part of the US defense infrastructure. However, these installations were constructed deep within mountains, protected by thick layers of reinforced concrete, steel, and rock, specifically engineered to resist the overpressure and thermal radiation generated by nuclear detonations. By contrast, Camp Century's construction beneath the Greenland ice sheet, while certainly offering some degree of insulation from external conditions, was not designed with nuclear survivability in mind. The base was built within a network of tunnels cut into compacted snow and ice, not solid rock. Although the ice provided some natural shielding, approximately 20 to 30 meters of overburden at most locations, this protection was minimal compared to the requirements for a facility to withstand a direct nuclear blast. A nuclear detonation produces overpressure waves exceeding 20 pounds per square inch, even several kilometers from ground zero, and the fragile, deformable structure of ice is ill-suited to absorb or deflect such forces. Furthermore, thermal radiation from a nuclear explosion can cause massive melting and destabilization of ice structures, leading to tunnel collapses and widespread flooding. Moreover, from a strategic perspective, it's unlikely that Camp Century would have been a primary target in a Soviet first strike. The USSR's nuclear targeting priorities focused on high-value assets, ICBM silos, air bases, command and control centers, and major industrial hubs in the continental United States and Allied territories. While the idea of a hidden missile base beneath Greenland might have been cause for alarm had the Soviets known of Project Iceworm's true intentions, there's no historical evidence to suggest the USSR had concrete intelligence on Camp Century's clandestine role during its operational years. If the Soviets had discovered Camp Century and chosen to target it, the logistics of delivering a precise nuclear strike to such a remote location would have been formidable. Greenland's geographic isolation made it an impractical target for a conventional nuclear attack. The delivery of a nuclear payload to Camp Century would have likely required a long-range bomber mission, or a specialized SLBM or submarine-launched ballistic missile strike, both of which carried enormous risks and strategic trade-offs for the Soviet Union. Moreover, the relatively small size and limited operational capacity of Camp Century compared to major US military installations would have made it a lower priority target. In terms of the survival bunker theory, it's important to recognize the distinction between concealment and protection. While the ice did conceal Camp Century from conventional surveillance, it did not provide the structural fortitude or depth to serve as a true nuclear survival bunker. Unlike NORAD facilities built under mountains, Camp Century's thin ice cover and fragile tunnel system could not have withstood the combined effects of blast, shockwaves, and heat from even a near-miss nuclear detonation. The passage of decades since Camp Century's abandonment has done little to resolve the enduring questions about the base. Despite numerous declassified documents and research expeditions, several critical mysteries remain unanswered. What exactly caused the ice shifts that forced the closure? Was there an undisclosed accident or contamination incident that precipitated the evacuation? Why was the nuclear reactor dismantled but large quantities of radioactive waste and military infrastructure left behind under the assumption of permanent ice cover? These unresolved issues continue to inspire both academic investigation and speculative theories. In recent years, the accelerated melting of Greenland's ice sheet due to global warming has reignited interest in Camp Century. Scientists warn that as the ice melts and shifts more rapidly, it could expose the remains of the camp, including hazardous radioactive waste, and potentially reveal forgotten tunnels and installations. While this is in itself a reason for concern, re-examining Camp Century through multiple lenses also reveals a Cold War saga marked by innovation, deception, and an ongoing mystery. Official accounts cite shifting ice as the reason for the base's closure. Alternative theories delve into the potential for hidden agendas and technological experiments that shaped both the base's existence and demise. As climate change gradually unveils the secrets frozen beneath Greenland's ice, a clearer understanding of Camp Century's true purpose and the broader strategic calculations of its era may finally emerge. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.